Imagine standing on a boat off the coast of Cedar Key, Florida, staring down at government workers dumping garbage into the ocean. 500,000 tons of it. Restaurant scraps. Discarded shells scraped off kitchen floors. And you're watching, convinced you're witnessing an environmental crime in real time. That's exactly what happened here. For 17 years, the state of Florida trucked waste to the coast and tipped it into the Gulf. And the people who knew these waters best were furious about it. Fishermen who'd worked these flats for generations stood up at public hearings and called it exactly what it looked like: dumping. Environmental groups warned it would smother whatever life was still clinging to the seafloor. And then, years later, survey teams went back down expecting to document a very expensive failure. What they found instead made seasoned scientists go quiet. Because the dead seafloor wasn't dead anymore. Something down there was building itself back to life faster than anyone thought was biologically possible. To understand why this story is so strange, you have to go back to what this stretch of Gulf Coast actually looked like before any of it started. Picture flat gray sand stretching in every direction, mile after mile of nothing. No structure, no sado, nothing for a fish to hide behind, nothing for a drifting larva to grab onto. This bottom hadn't always been like this. For thousands of years, the coast around Cedar Key was armored by vast oyster reefs, living structures that filtered the water and blunted the force of storms before they reached the shore. But by the early 2000s, those reefs were a shadow of what they'd once been. Decades of overharvesting had torn them apart faster than they could regrow. Pollution choked them. Development buried them under runoff and silt. The water turned murky, the seagrass thinned out, and the fish that once filled these waters simply moved on. By most accounts, this section of coastline was finished. A wasteland. And nobody, least of all the people proposing to fix it, believed a pile of restaurant trash was going to change that. The idea itself was almost stubbornly simple. Every single day, restaurants and seafood processing plants across Florida were throwing away mountains of oyster shells, tens of thousands of pounds a week, all of it headed straight for the landfill. Someone had the idea to intercept that waste before it got buried, collect the shells, truck them to staging areas near the coast, load them onto barges, and drop them onto carefully chosen patches of dead Gulf floor near Cedar Key, where the old natural reefs had collapsed. The hope was that these old shells might act as a kind of scaffolding, something solid in a place that had nothing solid left to offer. Between 2007 and 2024, more than 500,000 tons of shell went into the water this way. And from the very beginning, the backlash was immediate and loud. This wasn't a handful of internet cranks complaining. The opposition came from people with real expertise and real stakes in these waters. Marine scientists argue that you don't repair a damaged ecosystem by piling material on top of it. You risk smothering whatever fragile life remains. Multi-generational fishing families, whose grandparents had worked these same flats, worried that all this barge traffic and shell dumping would stir up sediment, cloud the water, and finish off a coastline that was already barely hanging on. These weren't unreasonable fears. On paper, dumping 500,000 tons of waste onto a wounded seafloor sounds like exactly the kind of well-intentioned plan that makes a bad situation worse. Even the officials running the program braced themselves for the criticism because they knew how it looked from the outside. So why did they go ahead with it anyway? The reasoning, when you actually sit with it, was almost brutally practical. Those shells were heading to a landfill no matter what happened. That part was certain. They were waste, full stop. So the calculation became, if there's even a real possibility this waste could function as a foundation for a reef, if there's a genuine chance it could give the Gulf floor something it desperately needed, then the experiment is worth trying. The worst-case outcome was waste ending up in roughly the same condition it was already headed for. The best-case outcome, if it worked, could be enormous. So they moved forward, absorbed the criticism, and started filling barges. Here's where the story gets interesting, because everyone involved understood the general rule for artificial reefs. Whether you're sinking concrete blocks, steel structures, or old ships, you don't expect any meaningful biological activity for at least 2 to 3 years. Life in the open Gulf moves slowly. Colonization takes time. So the research team scheduled their first serious survey about 18 months out. And honestly, a lot of them expected to confirm exactly what the critics predicted: a gray, lifeless pile slowly sinking into the sand, doing nothing. That is not even close to what they found. 18 months in, well ahead of any reasonable timeline, life was already spreading across those shell mounds. Not a few stray organisms that had wandered in by accident, but active, structured biological growth colonizing the surfaces of that discarded shell. And the deeper the researchers looked, the stranger the whole thing became, because this recovery wasn't just early, it was denser and more complex than any model had predicted. The shells weren't behaving like passive junk, waiting to be buried by sediment. They were behaving like triggers, like they were actively switching on biological processes that the surrounding Dead Sea floor simply couldn't start on its own. The explanation wasn't something you could see by picking up a shell and looking at it. You could hold one in your hand on the deck of a research boat and see nothing unusual at all. The real story was happening at a microscopic scale, in a layer of chemistry and biology invisible to the naked eye, and it had begun rewriting the rules within days of those shells hitting bottom. So the researchers did what any good investigator does when the obvious explanation falls apart. They zoomed in. They stopped treating the shells as inert objects and started examining their surfaces under a microscope. Within days of hitting the Gulf floor, not weeks, days, bacterial communities had already moved in and begun organizing themselves into what scientists call a biofilm, a structured living layer bound together by a matrix the bacteria secrete on their own. If you've ever run a finger across a slick rock in a stream and felt that faint slipperiness, you've touched a biofilm. But under magnification, this wasn't random slime. It was organized, layered, almost architectural. And this is where the story stops being about shells and starts being about chemistry. Oyster shells are built largely from a mineral called aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate. Sitting in seawater, aragonite does something quiet but continuous. It slowly dissolves, releasing calcium ions into the immediate surrounding water. That constant trickle of calcium changes the chemistry right at the surface of the shell, creating a tiny localized zone that's more alkaline, more buffered than the open Gulf around it. Essentially, a microscopic chemical halo clinging to every single shell in that 500,000-ton pile. Now here's the question worth sitting with. Who in the ocean actually needs that kind of chemical environment? The answer is every organism that builds a hard shell of its own. Barnacles, tube-worms, and critically, juvenile oysters. These organisms, drifting as microscopic larvae, don't settle just anywhere at random. They're actively searching the water for a specific chemical signal, a cue that essentially tells them, this surface is safe, commit here, spend the rest of your life fixed to this spot. And the old discarded shells were broadcasting exactly that signal. Shells that had been thrown out as garbage were chemically inviting the next generation of oysters to come build a home on top of them. The dead were calling out to the living, and the living were answering. Once that first microscopic layer locked into place, everything else followed in sequence. The bacterial biofilm became a foothold for microalgae, tiny single-celled plants that need only a surface and a bit of sunlight to establish themselves. That created a thin base layer of food, and the moment there's food at the bottom of a system, something arrives to eat it. Tiny crustaceans, copepods, amphipods, larval mollusks moved in to graze. As they multiplied, they became food themselves, which drew in the first small fish, darting in to feed on the grazers. Each stage built the platform for the next. A food web wasn't dropped onto these shells from the outside. It assembled itself from the ground up, one link at a time. This is exactly why the surrounding sand had been such a dead end for so long. A bare sandy seabed offers nothing to attach to. Larvae searching for a home, they find only shifting grains that bury and suffocate anything trying to settle. No chemical signal, no hard structure, nothing to hide behind, nothing to build on. Florida's soft Gulf bottom hadn't failed because nothing wanted to live there. It had failed because nothing could get a grip. The shells didn't fight that dead end directly. They simply bypassed it, dropping a hard, calcium-rich, signal-emitting island into the middle of an ecological desert, and life that had been waiting for exactly that condition came rushing in. But here's the twist that almost derailed the entire program before anyone understood what was actually happening. None of this was visible from the surface. 6 months in, if you motored out and looked down through the water at one of these shell sites, you'd see a dull gray heap slowly settling into the bottom, looking for all the world like nothing was happening. You could have taken a photo and captioned it "expensive failure," and nobody watching from a boat deck would have argued with you. But the picture lied. Underneath, invisible to the eye, a fully functioning microscopic ecosystem was already assembled and running. Bacteria, biofilm, algae, grazers, the first small fish, an entire engine quietly humming along, just too small and too early for anyone to see with the naked eye. This is the point where the real significance of the whole project starts to come into focus, because there was one particular species this entire process had been building toward, a species whose survival had been hanging on a single missing ingredient for decades. Here's the fact that changes everything about how you think about oysters. An adult oyster doesn't move. Ever. It spends its entire life cemented to one hard surface, filtering water, growing, and eventually dying in the exact spot where it first landed. Which means the single most important moment in an oyster's entire existence happens in the first couple of weeks of its life, while it's still a microscopic drifting larva. That larva rides the currents, searching, and it's working against the clock. Within roughly 2 weeks, it has to find a hard surface, attach itself, and cement down permanently. If it finds one, it lives and eventually becomes part of a reef. If it doesn't, if those 2 weeks run out over open sand or silt with nothing to grip, it sinks, smothers, and dies. There's no second attempt, no drifting back out to try again later. The future of the species runs entirely through that narrow window. For most of Florida's history, that gamble was a relatively safe one because the coast was lined with old natural reefs, mounds of shell built up over centuries, each one a ready-made landing zone for the next generation of larvae. It was a self-sustaining loop. Old oysters created surfaces for young oysters, who grew up and created more surfaces in turn, a cycle running quietly for thousands of years. Over roughly a century, human activity took that loop apart piece by piece. Overharvesting stripped the historic reefs bare, and unlike natural die-off, the harvested shells didn't return to the water. They went to roads, driveways, landfills, poultry feed. Every truckload removed was one more landing strip gone from the Gulf permanently. Pollution and runoff clouded the water and buried what reef structure remained. Upstream dams and diversions threw off the salinity balance oysters depend on. And coastal development hardened the shoreline itself with seawalls and marinas, paving over the shallow water where reefs used to grow. By the early 2000s, the math had turned genuinely bleak. The surviving adult oysters were still spawning, still releasing larvae into the water by the millions each season. Reproduction hadn't failed at all. What had failed was the landing. Those millions of larvae would drift, search, and find nothing, mile after mile of soft, shifting bottom without a single hard surface to grip. The 2-week clock would run out, and they'd die by the millions, season after season, not from disease or poison, but simply because there was nowhere left to land. This wasn't a predator problem or a pollution problem in the traditional sense. It was, at its core, a real estate problem. The Florida coast had quietly become a place where oysters could be born but could not settle. And a species that cannot settle is a species on a countdown. Now, put the shell mounds back into that picture and watch what happens. Suddenly, scattered across that empty, lethal stretch of sand, there are concentrated islands broadcasting exactly the surface and exactly the chemical signal those drifting larvae had been dying to find. The 2-week clock that had been a death sentence for an entire generation suddenly had a finish line again. The larvae arrived, and this time they landed. The numbers that came back blew past even the most optimistic projections on paper. Within a single year, juvenile oysters weren't just surviving on the shell mounds. They were attaching in dense, crowded carpets, packed shoulder to shoulder the way a healthy oyster reef is supposed to look. And then came the part that turned this from a clever fix into something closer to a self-sustaining machine. By the second year, those juveniles from year one had matured into full-grown, reproductive adults, and they began releasing their own larvae directly above a surface those larvae could actually land on. The mound had stopped simply receiving life from elsewhere. It had started generating its own. The loop that had been broken for a century had quietly clicked back into place on a heap of restaurant scraps off the coast of Cedar Key. By the third year, the survey numbers stopped sounding like a modest recovery and started sounding almost implausible. Researchers counting oyster density on the shell mounds were recording hundreds of living oysters per cubic meter of material, while survey plots on the untreated bare seafloor just a few feet away turned up next to nothing. The contrast was stark enough to look like someone had drawn a line across the ocean floor, desert on one side, a dense living structure on the other. And the most remarkable part wasn't even the density of the living oysters. It was what the reef did with its dead. When an oyster died, its shell didn't disappear, it stayed fused in place, becoming brand new landing surface for the next wave of larvae. The reef was recycling its own losses into more growth, climbing higher and spreading wider with no additional trucks, no more barges, no ongoing budget. The original intervention had ended, but the reef never got the message to stop. And once the oysters took hold, everything else started coming back. Local charter captains who had spent years fishing these waters and testifying against the program began reporting that redfish were showing up over the shell mounds in numbers they hadn't seen in a quarter century. It would be easy to dismiss this as fish simply relocating toward new structure, the way they gather around any shipwreck. But when researchers checked the actual data, the story didn't hold up as a simple relocation. Within a couple of years, total biomass around the reef sites had climbed dramatically compared to untouched control areas nearby, and species diversity rose right alongside it. Crucially, much of that increase was driven by juveniles, young fish that had hatched and grown up right there, using the shell crevices as shelter for bigger predators. This wasn't a case of fish being shuffled around the Gulf. This was new life being produced. The reef wasn't acting like a magnet pulling existing fish in. It was functioning as a nursery, generating population growth from scratch.